The man in my basement takes one step closer every week. Part 11. None of these rules are set in stone. The intruder seems to evolve and react depending on your actions. How I ended up in Paul's basement didn't matter right now. I just wanted out. Easier said than done, especially considering I lost both crutches in the chase. But at least the light was on. For now, let's pray to God the bunker door wasn't locked. Leaning against the concrete wall for support, I shimmied up onto one foot. Hobbling forward, I maneuvered my way through the maze, one painful step at a time. Tedious didn't even begin to describe it. Nearly 3 hours went by until I finally found footprints. The same footprints from when Paul and I were down here a few days back. Something to follow. Thank God. Encouraged, I shuffled my way forward bit by bit when a hollow thud from somewhere deep within the maze. A fist thumping against plywood. My heartbeat quickened. I picked up pace, rounded another corner. More thumping. Quicker now. Closer to. I hobbled faster, my limp cast leg dragging uselessly behind me. More thumping. 2 quick thumps each time now. Like a heartbeat, the rhythm almost matching the pace of my own heart. Getting quicker and quicker as the sound moved ever closer. I rounded another corner and, finally, the exit was in sight. Somehow the bunker door was open. Inexplicably open. Another suspiciously convenient blessing. With renewed vigor, I pushed forward. The thumping echoed in the hallway just behind me now, right on my heels. The light snapped off. Pitch dark. Only the faint glow of moonlight cast against the basement steps up ahead. I pulled closer, one painful lurch at a time. Finally close enough, I pushed off the wall and staggered through the open door, falling chin first into the stairs. The thumping sound right behind me. I pushed up, slammed the bunker door shut, and latched the lever down. Another close call. I stood motionless at the door, listening for minutes. Nothing. Dead. Silence. I looked back over my shoulder. The door at the top of the basement steps was open too. Wide open. Bluish moonlight revealed the foyer above. Why were all the doors left open? I turned and used the railing to pull myself upward. Another painful and tedious slog. Trying my best to be as quiet as possible. Not easy. The last thing I wanted was for Paul to wake up and find me crawling out of his basement with no good excuse. After 10 minutes of painstaking effort, I finally reached the main floor. The mother and lawyer smell of vanilla-flavored cigarillos hung in the air. On my hands and knees, I crawled towards the front door, going even slower than before so as not to make a sound. Inch by inch, when I finally reached the door, I grabbed a sturdy umbrella from a bucket in the corner and used it to push up to standing. A makeshift cane, no match for a crutch, but it sure as duck beat crawling. I reached for the doorknob and froze. A pressure suddenly pushed into my forehead. Like a migraine, I rubbed my brow with the back of my thumb. Stopped, lowered my hand. That was the weird tick. The thing Howie did. The thing Paul did. The thing Mitch did before he. When did I start doing it? Why did I start doing it? I shook it off and reached for the door, but again stopped short. Another recurring question bubbled up from my subconscious: who is Paul's so-called old friend? Who was the person in the room down the hallway? I peered back over my shoulder, trying to push the curiosity away, trying to just reach for the door and leave, but I couldn't. That's strange. Mother and lawyer. Almost magnetic pull of needing to know the answers grew stronger with each passing second. I glanced around the foyer. Where did Paul sleep? Save for the basement. It wasn't a big house. There were only 3 doors in that hallway, and one of them was probably a bathroom. I turned fully around, stepped forward into the foyer, and lurched to another stop. No, it's not safe here. My survival instinct screamed so profoundly I could almost hear it. Go home. Finally listening to my smarter self, I turned back for the door. Go home and sleep. I turned the knob and another question jumped into my head. What if Zach's in the room? There's no possible way. Did the timelines even match up? How old would he be now? How would the police not have known? But if it was Zach, maybe I could get a photo. Take it to the law. My feet were bringing me back down the hallway before my head even made up its mind. Thank God the floors were carpeted or I'd have woken up the whole neighborhood. Another painful hobble down the hallway until I reached the door to the mysterious room. And froze. I took 3 deep, intentional breaths in and out, then reached for the handle. Locked. I tried again. Still locked. Not sure what I expected. I looked around. The house was quiet, motionless, almost like everything was on pause. Frozen in time to an unnatural degree. A stillness that reminded me of the first night I found the coat rack. The same unsettling quiet in the air. Another weird thing I didn't have time to think about right now. I pulled the switchblade out from my back pocket and shimmied it into the door frame. I've got a lot of experience with discreetly unlocking doors. Don't ask. I tilted the knife upwards, pushed forward over the latch and the foyer light flicked on. My view snapped down the hallway. Footsteps. Footsteps coming from the living room. I staggered backward into the kitchen. Just in time. Hello. Paul's voice echoed. How did he get out here? Was he asleep on the couch? I ducked down beneath a bar, separating the kitchen from the living room. This was not a good situation no matter how you spun it, especially considering the fact Paul owned a gun. A gun he wasn't afraid to use. Part of me wanted to come out of hiding, explain myself, but at this point, it felt likely Paul was being influenced by the intruder, possessed even. Either way, I still needed to know who was in that room. Hello? Paul's voice echoed down the hallway this time. I huddled further into the shadowy corner, waiting, listening. Paul strode back into the living room. He flicked another light on. A stretch of draining silence followed he was listening to. He was waiting. A long, silent standoff crawled by. 5 minutes at least. Nothing but the sound of my own breathing. Then, Paul cleared his throat and moved towards the kitchen. Towards me. His footsteps getting closer and closer until the floor beneath me jostled slightly. Paul was standing on the opposite side of the bar now. If he leaned forward and peeked down, that was it. I held my breath, knife still in hand. Shit, I should have tucked it away earlier. Now, I really looked crazy. Crazy and dangerous. Too late now. Paul was close enough to hear even the slightest movement. Another impossibly long silence dragged by seconds like minutes, minutes like hours. Holding my breath all the while. Growing tenser and tenser. Until, flick. The switchblade flicked open. My tense grip must have bumped the switch. Ducking idiot. The floor creaked as Paul stepped back from the counter. My head raced 1,000 thoughts a second. Paul huffed. And stepped forward again. Suddenly, the tips of his fingers slipped into view. Gripping over the edge of the countertop above me. The bar top bent and strained as he leaned forward, pressing his weight down against it, inching closer and closer. Paul was going to peer underneath the counter and see me hiding there crazy-eyed, sleep-deprived, armed with a switchblade, and buzz buzz buzz, somewhere in the house. A phone, my savior, vibrated against a wooden surface. Paul huffed again. His hand slipped out of view, and he strode back into the living room, away from the kitchen. Finally, I inhaled a breath of overwhelming relief. A relief that quickly faded when I realized my situation hadn't changed. He'd come back soon enough, and I needed to be somewhere else when he did. Mitch, said Paul, his voice father-in-lawed with bewilderment. No, it's okay, he was speaking softly now. Comforting. Silence. Paul was listening to Mitch now, or whatever it was claiming to be Mitch on the other end. Who the duck knew at this point? You're sure it was him? Said Paul. Listening. When? More listening. MHM. A short pause. Did you call the police? Another pause. No. I understand. That makes sense, yeah. MHM, okay. Mitch, not right now. But at some point we should at least get some authorities involved. Okay. He's clearly not well, yeah, okay, I'll meet you there. He strode back into the living room and pulled a jacket on. What in the duck was going on here? Were they talking about me? Why was Mitch suddenly talking to his supposedly estranged father? Was that even Mitch? There's no way it had to be the intruder. Messing with Paul. But was that even Paul? My head was exploding with an influx of questions. If the intruder's goal was to make me go insane with confusion and paranoia, then mission accomplished. Congratulations. Paul strode down the hallway again. He was coming back towards the kitchen. Duck. He stopped in front of the kitchen entrance. Standing in the hallway, his back was mostly turned to me. All he needed to do was look slightly to his right, and the jig was up. 10 long seconds dragged by until finally, he turned towards the mysterious guest room. Went for the handle and it was locked. Shaking his head, he reached up on top of the door frame, slid his hand across, pulled down a key, and unlocked the door. He cracked it open and peered into the dark room. Mitch called, said Paul. Something happened at his place. Gonna see if he's alright. Back in a few hours, give or take. He pulled the door, mostly closed, and froze. He pushed it open again. Open or closed? No audible response. Paul locked the door from the inside, pulled it shut, and tucked the key back on top of the door frame. He marched back towards the foyer, flicking off all the lights as he went. Suddenly he froze. Another long silence dragged by, and then the foyer light flicked on again. What was he doing? The answer hit me like a bag of bricks to the face. The door. I forgot to close the door at the top of the basement stairs. In my defense, it was open when I got here, but I doubted that was Paul's doing. I could hear him creep across the foyer and stop. Now, I assumed he was at the top of the basement steps, standing in front of an open door he never left open. He pulled the door shut, locked it, and wandered back into the foyer. Then, he started pacing back and forth, pacing circles. Duck, he muttered to himself, clearly in the middle of a panic attack, or something even worse. This continued for 3 long minutes until finally, he stormed out the front door, and slammed it shut behind him. Silence. Outside, a bike engine turned on, peeled out of the driveway, and sped off. He was gone. Finally, my eyes drifted back towards the guest room door, curiosity burning stronger than ever. But I decided to wait 3 minutes longer, just in case Paul forgot something and came back. 3 minutes went by. I crept out into the hallway. I hobbled to the door, reached up on the frame, slid my hand across and found the key. Hand shaking, I unlocked the door and stopped. I breathed deep. What if it was Zach on the other side? What if it really was just an old friend of Paul's? What would I do with the knowledge? Was my obsession for answers really pulling me deeper into the intruder's web? I turned my head sideways and placed my ear against the door. The slow and muffled beep 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 of what sounded like a heart monitor. I leaned back, took a deep breath, turned the knob, and pushed open the door. Gut-wrenching stench hit me like a wall, like rotting food and burnt hair. A smell so strong I could almost taste it. Turning away, I clenched my eyes shut and buried my nose into my inner elbow. I held there until the stench subsided somewhat. I turned back towards the room. Most of it was hidden in shadows, cluttered with military-grade medical equipment. Just like the room in my vision. Heart monitors, 4 bags, even a table laden with surgical tools. Near the window was a slightly inclined hospital bed. On the bed lay a man. Or at least that's what I assumed. He was wrapped in medical bandages. Medical tubes stuck out of his arms, his wrists, even his legs. Bandages covered most of his face, save for his lower jaw. And a small slit for the eyes. I crept forward. The slow rhythmic beep of the heart monitor remained steady. Whoever it was, they weren't aware of my presence yet, but I didn't care either way. I just needed to know. I reached the side of the bed and stopped. His eyes were clenched shut, as if pretending to sleep. His exposed jaw was scarred and mangled. Parts of his lips were peeled back, revealing teeth behind. I am no medical expert, but it looked like a severe burn victim. If this was Zach, I couldn't tell. He would have been so much older now anyway. But whoever it was, they looked fit for an intensive care unit, not a guest bedroom. Was Paul keeping them here as a guest to ward off the intruder? I couldn't imagine anyone in their right mind agreeing to this willingly. I was about to turn back when, out the hallway, the front door clicked open, and a light flicked on. Paul was back. I cast my view around the room, desperately searching for a place to hide when the man on the bed's eyes snapped open. Cold blue eyes, strikingly mother-in-law to Paul's. He was looking straight at me, wide and fearful, thudding footsteps getting closer. Without thinking, I clambered beneath the bed and pulled my cast leg in behind me, cramped between tangled wires and green metal crates. I hid. The footsteps stopped in the doorway. The bedroom light flicked on. How did you open this? Paul's voice reverberated into the room. No response. What's wrong? Again. No audible response. Paul huffed, flicked the light off, and pulled the door shut, leaving me alone with the burn victim. The burn victim, I am pretty sure was Paul, or at least, some version of him. I recommend measuring the distance from him to the furthest corner of the house. Calculate how long it will take him to reach you. Set up your bedroom as far away as possible. Once established, do not move your bed. You must sleep there from now on. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor kept me from falling asleep. All the while, I could hear Paul mulling about around the house, doing God knows what at 4 in the morning. This went on for about an hour until finally silence. Silence, and early morning birds chirping awake outside. It was still dark out, but the sun was rising. Another 10 minutes went by until I decided it was safe to leave climbing out from underneath the bed. I pushed up to standing. Relief poured through my sore, cramped body. I looked back. The man on the bed was asleep, eyes closed. Of course, maybe it wasn't Paul, but the resemblance, even through the gruesome scars, was striking. That, and the fact one version of Paul supposedly burned to death. At this point, who else would it be? I needed a photo, just in case. I pulled out my phone and the battery was dead. Of course, tucking my phone away, I turned back and staggered across the room. I placed my ear against the door. I listened. The low hum of the fridge, the occasional drip of a leaky faucet. Okay. I pushed open the door and peered out. Somehow, the hallway was darker than before, empty, as far as I could tell. I crept out, and pulled the door shut behind me, shimmying against the wall. I made my way towards the entrance, almost free, almost home. Pushing off the wall, I stumbled into the foyer and thumped into the front door. A reverberating thud echoed through the house. Duck. Dread hung in the air as I braced for a response, but nothing came. Only more silence. Relieved, I reached, turned the knob and, ducking locked. From the outside, I pulled my switchblade out and stuck it into the frame. Sliding forward behind me, down the hallway, a door clicked open. I looked back over my shoulder. It was the door to the room of Paul's burnt-up doppelganger. Duck this. I turned back to the door and, Brandon. A voice from the left. I snapped to look. Only the darkened living room. Struggling to pull the knife out from the door, I squinted into the shadows. In the far corner, by a draped shut window, a silhouette, seated on a couch. Are you okay? The mother-in-law voice from the darkness echoed. For a moment, almost sounding like my father, someone rose to standing and stepped into a beam of pale moonlight. It was Paul. Cold blue eyes, father-in-law with confused disappointment. His eyes glanced to the wedged knife gripped in my hand. Then, back to me. Mitch called, he said, trying to stay calm, acting like nothing bad was happening, even though it clearly was. He's worried about you. He took a careful step forward. I flinched, pulled, and yanked the knife out from the door frame. Paul gently raised a hand. "We're okay." He stepped back. "No need for that. Full disclosure. I've got a 9 mother-in-law sitting on the table there." He glanced down to his left. A black Finnish handgun sat on top a stack of books. "But there's no reason for any of that, right?" He nodded slightly, as if to answer his own question. I lowered the knife, but I didn't put it away. Maybe seeing an incomprehensible monster crawl out through Mitch's mouth gave me a few trust issues. "Mitch said you were really distressed last night. Said you broke down his door, ran away in a panic." I shook my head, painfully aware of how crazy I must have looked. "It's okay, Brandon. We're not pressing charges or anything like that. We're worried about you. Have you been sleeping?" I chuckled bitterly, turned back towards the door, and stuck the knife back into the doorframe. I was done playing this stupid game. In my peripherals, Paul stepped over to the table, crouched down, picked up the gun, and tucked it into the back of his waist loop. "Brandon," said Paul, again, sounding oddly similar to my late father, the same way Dad sounded, knocking on my bedroom door after Zach died. "You're letting this get to you. I know what it's like. Trust me, I know better than most." I turned to look at him again. "Why's your door locked from the outside?" Paul shook his head. "It's not." I grabbed the handle and turned it to show. The door popped open, and the wedged knife clattered to the floor. I blinked confusion, shrugged, held the door frame and, "I am not letting you go," said Paul. It sounded more like pleading than a threat. I stopped, looked back towards him, down at the gun. "You gonna shoot me?" "We're gonna wait here till help comes." "Help is in cops. They're going to bring you to the hospital. Get you some help." "A psych ward. They're not like the movies. Trust me, I've been in more than a few." I scoffed, a growing sense of bitter spite swelling up in my throat. All the confusion, all the questions, all the vagueness boiled into a twisting mass of rage. "Who's in the ducking room?" Paul glanced down the hallway. "An old friend." I grit my teeth. "An old friend burned to shit that just happens to look exactly like you. He was injured in the war, Brandon. I am his caretaker." I shook my head in disbelief. Paul had an answer for everything. "You expect me to buy that? It's using you. I can see it in your eyes. Then why am I trying to help you?" I opened my mouth to respond, but stopped short, as if the insanity of my own thoughts was too strange even to speak aloud. But I knew he was lying. I ducking knew it, somehow. The version of Paul who burned alive in the car wreck was also the one in the room down the hallway. I didn't know how. I didn't know why, but I knew it was true. "Look, Brandon, nothing I say right now is gonna convince you of anything. And that's okay. But I need you to understand this thing is ducking with you right now. It's all in my head, right? No. Some of it's real. It has to be. I know. Some things happen to me that I can't explain. But that doesn't matter anymore. I put that aside and pretended it wasn't real." "Good for you," I said, squatting down and picking the knife back up. I turned around for the door and Paul drew his gun. He didn't aim at me, but he looked ready to fire. "You're not gonna shoot me. You're not gonna get far with that leg." He had a point there. "Brandon," Paul continued, "you broke in and entered with a deadly weapon. But I am on your side here. Even Mitch is on your side." I huffed, stepped back from the door, and pulled it shut. Paul relaxed, and tucked away his pistol. A long stretch of silence. I sighed. "Do you actually believe you're in control right now?" "What? It's using you. I can see it in your eyes. Do you know it? Or do you think you're still you?" Paul, at a loss for words, smother-in-lawed sadly, turned around, stepped back for the couch and I lurched forward, pushing open the front door in one smooth motion, scrambling onto the front lawn. Red and blue lights swept over the street ahead. I pushed up to my feet, staggering uselessly across the yard. "Brandon," Paul called after me, his voice father-in-lawed with protective concern. A cop cruiser skid to a stop on the street in front of me. Out from the passenger seat, a young cop whipped out, took cover behind the door and drew her weapon. "Get on the ground," she screamed, gun pointing directly at me. I just stood there, knife in hand, in shock, staring down the barrel of a handgun. Dropped the weapon. I looked back over my shoulder at Paul. His face was father-in-lawed with fear. Fear for my safety. I knew. I could see it in his eyes. Something slammed into me from the side. A burly cop tackled me into the dirt. The knife sailed from my hand and flew through the air. My head pushed into wet soil and grass. I was pinned down. Sudden realization flooded through me. This meant I would be dragged away to a psych ward. Forced to do their tests. Forced to take medication. Sleeping away from home. Breaking the cardinal rule again and again. The intruder gaining more and more influence with every passing night I spent away from home. A sense of overwhelming dread swarmed through me. With a burst of surprising strength, I kicked and swiped and flailed, somehow shoving the heavy-set cop off me. I scrambled, half crawling, half running. A useless attempt. The second cop hauled off the street towards me and sidewalled me back into the ground, both of them pinning me down now. Dead grass and clumps of dirt father-in-lawing my mouth. But I didn't give up. I kept fighting, This was life or death. I needed to escape. I kept pushing, struggling. Be careful with him. Paul's muffled voice cried out. A heavy blow cracked against the back of my head and darkness. I woke in the head of something not human, but not the intruder either. An animal. A strange and bizarre sensory experience, to say the least. 4 legs. A perspective on the world nearly impossible to explain. Was it a mountain lion? Was it a bear? I didn't know, but I was in a mother-in-law forest, staring down a straight hiking trail. Evening sunlight cut down through the trees above, speckling the snow-covered path with pockets of swaying light. Then I saw myself, ahead on the path. I was dressed for hiking, looking slightly older now, leg fully healed, oblivious to the creature in front of me. This version of me suddenly froze, staring directly towards me now, his eyes father-in-law with terror. He turned to run. Darkness. I woke in a room with greenish walls, cold fluorescent light cast over all. My arm was handcuffed to a bed railing. The room was unfamiliar, but I knew exactly where I was. Emergency room. Psych ward. Duck. He will begin in the furthest corner of your basement. Paul was right about one thing: psych wards aren't like the movies. At least this one wasn't. If anything, it felt more like a nursing home. Boring. Assisted living with cameras and security guards. No electroshock therapy. No drawn-out talks with stoic shrinks. No evil head nurse. The movies got one thing right though: isolation. Especially for the first few days. I was in hysterics. Strapped to a bed. Screaming about the man in the basement. Screaming about how sleeping away from home would only make him stronger. Give him more influence. Of course, I knew this behavior didn't exactly help my case for appearing sane. But when you're staring down the barrel of a gun, none of that really matters. Regardless, I calmed myself down after a few days. A steady cocktail of Seroquel and benzos might have helped too. Now, I had only one goal: appear sane enough to get discharged. Get back home and hopefully salvage this disastrous transgression. Maybe the intruder would give me some leeway since my being here was involuntary. Wishful thinking. I guess there's one other thing the movies get right. The more you try to appear sane, the more insane you appear. It's not easy to pretend things are normal when you believe an ever more powerful hive mind tool whatever the duck is trying to absorb you into itself. But I put up a decent show. To be honest, getting stuck in a psych ward is the last place I expected to be. Before this, it seemed like everything was leading up to some vast and terrible revelation. Like I'd finally get the answers to all my questions. A final, horrific revelation connecting all the pieces together. But now, I was stuck in a borderline nursing home, putting together cat puzzles and playing Uno with strangers. Not exactly the finale I had in mind. The anticlimax of it all was suspect, to say the least. I was still waiting for the hammer to drop. To wake up in my room and see a coat rack in the corner. Getting forced into a psych ward changed my view on a lot of things. There was one guy in there, he had OCD so bad he needed 7 cups of water on his bedside table at all times. Each cup needed to be slightly fuller than the last, but he also needed to drink from the 3rd, 4th, and 7th cups every 14 minutes. Then, pace around the psych ward 3 times. If he broke the ritual, he was convinced a man made out of paper would climb in through the vents and cut him in half. Shit like that might have seemed funny to me before, in a morbid kind of way, but after seeing it firsthand, after living through it myself, let's just say I don't look at homeless people rambling to themselves on the street the same way I did before. It's easy to make fun of things that make you uncomfortable. It's not so easy when you're the one going through hell. Paul came to visit too, or at least, he tried. I didn't sign off the first few times. As far as I was concerned, Paul wasn't Paul. The real Paul was trapped back in his house, barely alive, strapped to a hospital bed, and burned up almost beyond recognition. A prisoner in his own home. Mitch even showed up once too, but I refused him as well. Mitch wasn't Mitch either. Mitch was dead. A mangled heap of skin on his kitchen floor. Worst of all, I don't think either of them was even aware of it, but I believe that they believed they were actually themselves. Unwitting duplicates. Paul kept trying, showing up every other day. He even covered all my hospital brother-in-laws out of his own pocket. I was borderline broke, so that was appreciated. Out of curiosity more than anything else, I finally gave in. I finally signed off on Paul's visit. We sat down in the common area. Imagine a low-income high school lunchroom. Round tables covered in half-finished puzzles. Cold vinyl floors with flecks of mother-in-lawky gray. An older woman stood by the window. Rosa was her name. Every 10 minutes or so, Rosa would call out for the nurse. When the nurse showed up, she'd ask them for the time. They'd tell her the time, and she'd thank them. Rinse and repeat that for the last 3 hours straight. After a while, you start to tune out. Stuff like that. Everything becomes background noise eventually. Finally, the doors pushed open, and in walked Paul. Our eyes met. He mother-in-lawed sadly, strode across the room, pulled out a rickety chair, and sat down across from me. "How've you been?" I shrugged. He nodded, and pulled a brown envelope out from his jacket. He placed it flat down on the table and slid it towards me. "That's not gonna answer everything. but it might help some. Skeptical, I reached into the envelope and pulled out a stack of documents, papers, photos, ID cards. Paul cleared his throat. That's everything I could find on my friend in the guest room. Full warning, some of it's a little graphic. I scanned the first paper, hospital records, detailing a man named Lawrence Weiser. A photo, a man laying on a gurney in the Vietnam jungle covered in full body chemical burns. I flipped to the next page, mother-in-law Terry legal papers, giving Paul the right to shelter and look after Lawrence Weiser. Clearance to monitor and treat complications sustained due to long-term effects of a wartime injury. I flipped to the next page. A photo of Paul, much younger, was paper clipped to the corner, his arm wrapped over another man's shoulder. About the same age, both of them looked so much alike they could have been brothers. I kept flipping. More documents, more photos, IDs, birth certificates. If they were fake, Paul would have spent a lot of time and money making them. Maybe the intruder created them out of thin air. I turned the page. More photos of Paul. He was setting up a hospital bed in his house's spare bedroom. Mother-in-law Terry personnel helping out. I put the papers down and looked at him. And Paul scratched his neck. I know it barely answers anything, but at least it clears up one thing. I set the documents on top of the envelope and slid it back across to Paul. I drove to Mitch's apartment, 40 minutes out of town. Saw a ducking fetus monster climb out his mouth. Then I ran down the hallway and ended up in your basement. Hell, I am pretty sure my car's still parked out at Mitch's, and you're saying it's in my head. Paul nodded understandingly, looked back over his shoulder, making sure nobody was in earshot. It's not in your head, he said, turning back to face me. It's only partially in your head. This thing's got a foot in the door between reality and nothing, and if you let it, it'll push that door all the way open and never go back. I scoffed. Why all the runarounds? Why the stupid ducking rules? Paul leaned back into his chair. Mitch and I have different ideas on how to fix it. I figured accepting it's there and living life regardless is the best route. Mitch thinks that's what it wants you to do. Truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Why'd you say I could pass it off then? Paul looked at me, genuinely confused. In the park. I continued. You said I could build a bunker door, pass it off to somebody else. In the park. I looked at him in disbelief. Did he forget? I honestly don't know what you're talking about, said Paul. He seemed sincere, but I'd been fooled more than enough by now. In the park. You told me this long, drawn-out ducking story about how you fell in between these boulders, saw a man down between the rocks, told me the intruder dug a tunnel between the houses. A tunnel? You're serious? Look, Brandon, I don't know who you talked to, but it wasn't me. But that doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is you focus on moving past all this. Focus on getting better. The stronger you are, the healthier your mind is, the less power this has over you. Like I said before, once I stopped drinking, started caring for people close to me, all the crazy shit started going away. Things still happen, don't get me wrong, but I can deal with it now. You learn to cope. How do I know you're even you? You don't. Shit, I don't. But that doesn't matter either. I am here. I exist. You exist. Work with what you know. I didn't respond. How long have you been away from home now? 2-3 weeks. Has anything happened? Has the intruder shown up here? Have you died? I didn't answer, but I caught the point. This doesn't make any sense, I said, leaning forward, resting my arms on the table. That's the point. This thing preys off confusion, addiction, fear, repression, trauma. The more ducked up you are, the better a time it has. I mulled it over, still not convinced. Has the doctor helped? Paul continued. The meds. I gave a reluctant nod. As much as I hated to admit it, things didn't feel as crazy as they used to. I felt calmer, more stable. But like I said before, this was all too easy, uncomfortably anticlimactic. The night before I went to your house, I swerved, almost hit a bear. I smashed into a roadside post and cracked my head on the driver's side window. I saw things, experienced things. I saw you, driving, looking out through your eyes. Paul nodded, as if expecting the point to be raised. I am not gonna say it wasn't real, but it's only little snippets of moments, crumbs of conspiracy, just enough to create a narrative in your head that may or may not be real. Enough to keep obsessed. Enough to. I saw you, driving drunk. You swerved into somebody on a green bike, hit and run. It seemed like you tried to cover it up. Paul looked at me with deadly serious eyes. I'd kill myself before trying to cover up something like that, he said, with brutal conviction. Now, I am not saying it didn't happen, but it didn't happen in this world, and it didn't happen to me, whatever that's worth. Sure, I said, still not fully satisfied. Nurse, Rosa by the window, called out again. The staff was ignoring her now. Nurse. Paul looked around, expecting someone to help. She just keeps asking the time, I said. Paul pulled up his sleeve and checked the time on his watch. 5:58 in the afternoon, he said, smother-in-lawing warmly towards her. Rosa looked at Paul like he was an angel sent from above. Thank you. Paul nodded and turned back to me. More silence. I cleared my throat. You and Mitch talking again? Paul shook his head. No. He was just worried about you. Is all. Still thinks you're possessed. Something like that. Paul rubbed his jaw. I mean, it's not just that, though. I was a shit father too. I nodded. You remind me of my old man sometimes. Shit father too. Huh. I almost laughed. No, a hole here. He was alright. Where's he now? Dead. Ah. Sorry. It's okay. What got him? Lung cancer. Same thing that got my dad. In the liver though. A strange calm came over me. Something I hadn't felt since before this nightmare began. A feeling that maybe, despite all its misery, life was worth sticking around for, at least a little while longer, if for nothing else, just to see what happens. We talked about Howie too. Paul said Howie always struck him as weird. Even before the intruder. Maybe he was a servant of the intruder. Maybe he was an unwitting vessel, controlled by the intruder to spy on new recruits. Maybe he was just a weird guy who really liked the color green and crossword puzzles. Maybe some things were better left alone. A bell rang out through the PA system. Dinner will now be served in the cafeteria. Please line up on the marks, maintaining a 6-foot distance from one another. Paul hit the table gently with his fist. Well, I'll stop bugging you now. I forced a smother in Lao. Paul stood up. I am not asking you to trust me blindly here, but if you got the patience, I'd love to swing by and visit every so often. Don't got much else going on anyways. Sure, I said, still skeptical. Even though I didn't trust Paul, or anyone else for that matter. I had to admit, his presence made me feel a little less crazy, a little less alone. Besides, any visitor, even a potential vessel of the intruder, was preferable to no visitors at all. Take it easy, kid. He smother-in-lawed again, then strode back for the exit and pushed through the doors. Paul stopped by every single day for the next 2 weeks. We played cards, talked about hockey, politics, sometimes we'd talk about the intruder too, but less and less every day. Paul eventually brought me somewhat around, convinced me to work with the doctors. What have you got to lose anyways? A fair point. Paul told me to tell the doctors what they needed to hear. Tell them I acknowledge it was all in my head, even if we both knew that wasn't entirely true. Say what I needed to say to get out. But don't rush things. Only leave when I felt ready to. Reality is a spectrum. Things in the realm of thought and emotion don't exist or not exist in a binary state. Belief leads to real actions. Terrible and beautiful. Just look at religion. I am not a believer myself, but it's pretty staggering the simultaneous beauty and horror created by mythic ideologies. True or not, sometimes it feels like belief itself has more effect on the real world than anything else. I don't know. Maybe the intruder worked in a smother-in-law way, molding itself out of belief, obsession, trauma, forcing itself out of the abstract into the concrete, like a virus of the mind. Who knows? Paul was there the day before my discharge. The doctors had determined I was stable enough to return to public life. I still felt like shit, but now in a normal constant haze of vague depression and anxiety kind of way, as opposed to a supernatural entity is trying to kill me kind of way. Paul and I played crib in the common area. Best out of 3. He won, as usual, stretching out his arms. Paul checked the time. Well, I should head out, he said, partially yawning. I'll swing by tomorrow. Give you a ride home. Sure, thanks, Paul. No worries, kid. Paul drove me home the next day. We pulled into my driveway, and sure enough, there sat my car, inexplicably back in its spot, no longer in front of Mitch's apartment. I opened my mouth to ask about it, but stopped myself short. Better leave well enough alone. So what's next for Brandon? He adjusted the rearview mirror as he spoke. I shrugged. Probably gonna move upstate, to be honest. Yeah, I don't blame you. I haven't checked my email in a while, but pretty sure I am jobless by now. That kind of just fell off the map. Paul chuckled. Fair enough. Is that a bad thing though? I mean, not really. Wasn't really my favorite job anyway. What are you gonna do now? I don't know. Maybe I'll go back to school. Maybe I'll start writing again. You write. I used to. And you enjoyed that? Yeah. Why'd you stop? No money. Well, if you move, sell the place. That might give you a bit of a cushion. Huh. Sure. I am not saying what you should do, Brandon. But if you like writing, then at least try for it. If you like something else, shoot for that. It's better than not trying. Trust me. I learned that the hard way. Yeah, maybe, I said, mulling it over. Looking back, this conversation, like many others, was a little strange, but I didn't think much of it at the time. Anyways, I'll get out of your hair now, said Paul. Silence. I reached for the door and stopped. Thanks, Paul, I said, looking back at him. It's hard to know what to say to someone who might have saved your life. You owe me one, he said, cracking a smother-in-law. I smother-in-lawed back, turned away, and unlatched the door. I stepped out, went to close it and, oh, one other thing. I froze, pulled the door back open, hunched down to meet his eyes. I know you're planning to move anyways, but Paul shifted in his seat slightly. It's probably better we keep minimal contact from here on out. Same goes for Mitch. I am not sure why, but this thing seems to feed off us being around each other. I nodded, stepped away, pushed the door shut, and turned back for my house. Paul pulled into reverse, backed across the street, and pulled into his garage. To this day, I don't know if that was even Paul, the intruder, or something in between. All I know is he helped me get back on my feet. So I am grateful for that. I rifled for my keys and something caught the corner of my eye. Down the street, parked about 7 houses away, a white hatchback with tinted windows, the same car I'd seen all those weeks ago. I don't know why it grabbed my attention, but it did. It felt out of place, sinister almost. I shrugged it off, turned away, and opened the door. The smell of cooking hit me. Chicken soup, gravy, and mashed potatoes. Howie, humming to himself. I pulled the door shut behind me, and was greeted with a bright green, brand new basement door. You like it? Howie's voice shot down the hallway. I turned. His bald head peeked out from the kitchen. Yeah, Howie, it's great. I lied. Howie's mother-in-lawed brightly and stepped out into the hallway. Work's picking up again. So it's from my own pocket. The least I could do for you letting me stay here. Thanks, Howie. How've you been? Mitch's dad sort of father-in-lawed me in a little. And he's apparently not dead. His kid told me otherwise. Some people are so weird. Huh, crazy's catching, I said. Huh, nothing. Oh, I got something. Howie slipped back into the kitchen and reappeared on the other side. This time with a crossword book in hand. 9 words. Third letter T. Last letter M. A naturally occurring yellow blackish liquid found in geological formations below the Earth's surface. I furrowed my brow. The word was on the tip of my tongue, but I couldn't quite place it. Howie looked at me, eyes father-in-lawing with anticipation. I shrugged again. Beats me. His eyes father-in-lawed with disappointment. I'll let you know if it comes to me. Sure, no problem. Howie slumped back into the kitchen and placed down the booklet. He looked like I just told him his dog died or something. I moved out the next week. Howie offered to stay, pay rent with his newfound income. I agreed. I never did find out exactly what made him leave his old place, but he never brought it up, so I didn't ask. I moved upstate, rented a small studio apartment in a mountain town. Still can't sleep in places with basements, but you can't really blame me on that one. Got back into writing hard too. Started taking online courses, watching YouTube tutorials, stuff like that. Got my craft to a place where I am not entirely embarrassed to share it. Weirdly, all these events actually inspired me to start writing again. Of course, all the loose ends, all the unanswered questions still bothered me. Something just felt too convenient about the last few weeks. Like I'd gotten out of the woods too easy. Like the hand of an invisible and benevolent God stepped in and waved away all my problems. Deus ex machina. But sometimes, I wondered if the intruder was still using me, working towards some unknown and terrifying endgame, an endgame that would reveal itself at any moment. Vague anxiety once again lingered beneath everything, like a constant, rising, shepherd tone, sometimes barely audible, sometimes unbearably loud. I did what I could to put it out of my mind, to focus on other things, not pushing it away, just being aware that it's there, and gently choosing to focus elsewhere. I am learning to live with it, learning to accept the unknowable. I'll admit one thing though, coat racks still freak me the duck out. Despite all my progress, there was something else I couldn't shake. One question that kept me up nights. What happened to Zach? Was it really what the police said? Just some long-haul semi-truck driver in the night? A terrible accident. But what about the visions of Paul? Drunk driving, hitting somebody on a green bike? What about the intruder's mimicry murder of Zach? Pleading and apologizing? What about the... I stopped myself from spiraling. These questions stuck in the back of my head like splinters of wood stuck between fingers. But even here, I am learning to live with it. About 6 weeks ago, I decided to look up Zach's mother, just to call her and see how she was doing, see if she was even still alive. It took a bit of work, but I found her. She lived in a care home down in Georgia. I called her on a Wednesday night. Hello, she said, her voice sounding almost how I remembered, despite all the years between. Mrs. Serrano, speaking. Hi, I am not sure if you'll remember me or not, but this is Brandon, mother-in-law. Brandon. Her voice father-in-law with recognition. Yeah, that's me. Oh, it's so nice to hear from you. How have you been? It's been so long. I am doing all right. We made small talk for a while. Talked about the town I grew up in. Talked about the pandemic. The craziness of the upcoming election. Then, the conversation took an unexpected turn. How's your father doing? She asked. Oh, he passed away quite a few years back now. Oh, I am sorry. It's okay. I've accepted it now. Yeah, I've mostly done the same with Zach, but it still hurts. That never goes away. But you learn to live with it. I didn't say anything, I was lost for words. Silence hung in the air until, you know, Zach always had trouble making friends before you. I didn't know that. Zach always struck me as effortlessly charismatic. He was a bit of an odd duck, but in a good way. Before we moved, none of the other kids ever really clicked with him. But with you, inseparable. Huh, yeah. I was the same way. How's that? Not good at making friends. More silence. I remember his passing hit you really hard. She said. You didn't speak for months. Your father was terribly worried about you. Yeah, I am doing better now, thankfully. That's good to hear. I am sure the closure helped too. It helped me. Closure? What? What closure? You didn't hear. Hear what? A driver, long-haul teamster, came forward a couple of years back. All those years back. He was sleep deprived, running a cross-state shipment when she trailed off. The tragedy spoke from the silence. She took a breath and continued. This driver. He grew overwhelmed with guilt. Came forward 2 years back to confess. I met with him too. A kind soul. Really. A sensitive soul. Wrong person. Wrong place. A terrible mistake. Where's he now? He took his own life a few months back. Poor soul. Neighbors found him in a basement corner. The words basement corner hit me like a concrete wall. Was this connected to the intruder? Was this connected to Paul? Nightmarish thoughts and incomprehensible images raced through my mind. The image of a naked body, pale and decomposing, slumped into a basement corner, a plastic bag wrapped over its head. You there? Said Mrs. Serrano. I stopped myself, took a deep breath, set it aside. Don't worry about it. It's a coincidence. I hope his mother-in-law is okay. I said. Me as well. Threads of conspiracy dangled in front of me like fishing lures. This had to be connected to the intruder somehow. It had to be connected to the rules. What's his name? I asked, almost involuntarily. The driver. Oh, Mason. Mason Parker the first, believe. I didn't recognize it. Awkward silence. Well, it's been lovely hearing from you, Brandon. But games night is about to start and I can't be late. Of course, you as well, Mrs. Serrano. Take care of yourself. Call anytime. Okay. She ended the call. I sat at my work desk. The glow of car lights beamed in through the window and swiped across the darkened walls. Raindrop shadows stretched across the room and returned into darkness. I took another deep breath, exhaled, doing my best to stay grounded, using a trick I learned from Paul. 3x4. Name 3 things you can see. Bookshelf. White wall. Brown desk. Name 3 things you can hear. Rain against the window. Tires against the road outside. Neighbor's footsteps up above. Name 3 things you can feel. The back of my legs against the seat. The warmth of the heater against my shins. The brush of my shirt as I breathe in and out. Name 3 things you can smell. Coffee. Gasoline. Burnt hair. Overwhelming terror pushed up from the floor. Into my toes. Through my legs. My spine. Into my head. A sickening upward swell of chemical dread. A feeling that something truly heinous. Something truly evil. Yet emotionless beyond human understanding was standing behind me. I imagined arms impossibly long, stretching from the shadows across the room. Unnaturally large hands. Fingers with extra joints, reaching for the scruff of my neck, eager to pull me down through the floor, down through the ground, down through the dirt, beneath the surface of reality itself, trapping me below an invisible barrier, suffocating me underwater with impenetrable surface tension, forcing me to watch, gasping for air as the world above moved on without me. The world above acted as if I never even existed to begin with. Eternal suffering. I spun around, expecting to see something incomprehensible. But there was nothing. No intruder. No coat rack. No man held together with nails and wire. Just an empty studio apartment. The orange glow of more headlights wiped across slow and yawing light crawling over the kitchen. Over the front door. Over me. Like the beams of a deep water submarine, scanning the ocean floor. Everything returned to moonlit darkness. Against the window drapes a faint, greenish and flickering glow from a neon bar sign across the street. I sniffed the air. The smell of gasoline and burnt hair was gone. Maybe it was never there to begin with. I took another deep breath and exhaled. It's all in my head. Or, at the very least, it's mostly in my head. But still, the words only rang partially true. If I'd learned anything over the past few months, it was this: nothing good comes easy. At least, not this easy. As much as I tried to repress it, as much I tried to ignore it, I knew something was missing. There was some piece of the puzzle that may, or may not, ever be found. I knew this wasn't finished. I took a deep breath, exhaled. I turned back to my desk, popped open my laptop, and started writing. If you see him, do not overreact. He may decide to move on. A bump in the night startled me awake. I checked the time, 2:58 a.m. Neon green light flickered in through the studio apartment window. I sat up onto the edge of my bed, staring at the closet door. A white closet door with zigzag patterns etched across it. Another thump above me. I looked up. It was the upstairs neighbors again, mulling about at 3 a.m. on a Wednesday night. Rubbing my eyes, I pushed off the bed, and strolled up to the window. It was snowing outside, first snowfall of the year. Drifting dots of white dissolving against the asphalt below. I was about to turn back when something caught my eye. Across the street, down in the plaza parking lot, a white hatchback with tinted windows, engine idling. Was it the same car from before? I shrugged it off, pulled the blinds shut, and crawled back into bed. But now I couldn't sleep. The bumps and scrapes of the upstairs neighbors felt louder. The flickering glow of the neon bar light across the street felt brighter. Everything felt heightened, like on fast forward. I rolled out of bed, marched across the room, and yanked open the closet door. A bunch of propped up junk toppled out onto the floor. Old records, unread books, unopened boxes. I pushed it all away and dug into the back of the closet, throwing junk over my shoulder until I found what I was looking for. An old box fan, and a red pleated quilt. I stuffed the quilt into the window frame, blocking the outside light. I set the fan up on a chair and blasted it towards my bed. White noise and darkness. I dug through a few more boxes until I found a pair of orange, disposable earplugs. Let's try this again. I climbed into bed, and shut my eyes, the gentle gust of the box fan against my face as I drifted off to sleep. There was something about that feeling. It felt like movement, and movement calms me down. Maybe that's why I enjoy aimless driving so much. I shut my eyes and finally fell asleep. I had a dream with Zach in it, but it was more like a memory than a dream. A vivid flashback playing out in the darkness of sleep like a strange and ethereal father-in-law. A memory from the week before Zach died. We had found an old car, rusted up and stuck down in the riverbeds by the Cauldron Cliffs. An old 1950s car, likely pushed off the cliff from above by some drunk college kids. Zach wanted to jump across the rocks, over the rushing torrents, and stand on top of the old car. I didn't share his enthusiasm. Risking death to stand on a car wasn't my idea of a good time. Zach bugged me about it, but didn't push. We went back home after that, up the winding trails, through the dried woods, up past Old House and the Rendlesons. We rounded a corner and stepped onto the final stretch of the trail. But Zach froze, pointed straight ahead, down the trail. About 50 feet or less, a man, dressed in white, with pin-straight posture, stood with his back to us. But this part never actually happened. It was a false memory, a creation of the strange dream. Or if it did happen, I'd forgotten it. Zach cupped his hands to his mouth and screamed, "Hey!" But the man didn't move. We both tensed up as a long silence ticked by. A growing sense of unease in the air. A summer breeze crawled through the woods behind us and kicked up dry dust from the trail. Sunlight caught through the plumes, and the wind faded back to quiet. Then Zach looked back at me. "We should go," he whispered. "Brandon." I looked at him. Zach's eyes were father-in-law with uncharacteristic fear. "We should." I snapped awake, cold sweat running down my forehead. Thanks to the blacked-out window, my room was pitch dark now. But something was wrong. I could no longer feel the brush of the fan against my face. I pulled out my earplugs. The fan was still on a whirring hum. I squinted through the dark as a slow and terrible realization crawled over me. Something was stood between me and the fan. Something was stood in the middle of the room. I grit my teeth, reached for my phone, turned on the screen, and shone it into the room. Empty. The brush of the fan against my face returned. The sense of a presence vanished. I stared into the empty room, waiting for something to happen. Almost willing something to happen. But nothing happened. For 5 long minutes, nothing changed. I rechecked the time, 3:58 a.m. I climbed out of bed, trudged across the room, flicked on the light, and strode back towards the window. I pulled the blackout quilt back, and peered outside. The snow was falling faster now. The parking lot across the street was empty. The white hatchback was gone. I looked back over my shoulder. On a hook beside the door, car keys. I drove up the number 7 highway. A winding mountain road. Headlights cut through falling snow like Warp Speed Star's window. Wipers wiped back and forth with percussive rhythm. My Toyota reverberated with the drones of rubber against wet asphalt. No other vehicles in sight. Like I said before, movement always calmed me down. Before I owned a car, I used to go for these long, solitary hikes out in the mountains. There's something about constant motion. Outside. Alone. Peaceful. I drove for over an hour without stopping, feeling calmer with each passing mother-in-law, reminding myself that I'd been away from that house with a basement for months now. Months of completely disregarding the rules, and nothing happened. No terrible revelations. No intruder from the basement. No evil doppelgangers. Only paranoid and fleeting moments of fear. Maybe, after all that, the rules really did mean nothing. Maybe Paul was right. The snow was falling faster now. Getting dangerous. I turned off on the 62 exit and wound back for home. The orange swipe of streetlights against the windshield. The drone of my car. The wiping of the wiper. Up ahead, red lights. Yellow hazards blinking on the side of the road. I sped past. It was the white hatchback with tinted windows. The front hood was popped open, and a man stood on the shoulder, trying to wave me down. But I didn't stop. Something felt wrong. But before even reaching the next exit, my heart changed. Horror stories ran through my head. Stories about broken down cars on lonely winter mountain roads, people freezing to death before the sun even came up. Begrudgingly, I signaled off at the next exit and hauled back around. I pulled a U-turn and parked up behind the white car. Hit my hazard lights. The driver wasn't standing outside anymore. The back door of his car swung open, and he stepped out. bundled in winter clothes with a scarf pulled up around his face, vaguely mother-in-lawyer. He waved, stepped up to the front of his car, and pulled the hood shut. He stepped around to the passenger side and pulled the door open. Hunching over, he reached into his glove box, took out a brown paper envelope, and tucked it into his winter coat. I studied him as he pushed the door shut and strode back towards me. Leaning over, I unlocked the passenger side door. The stranger latched the door open, hunched over, and looked at me, his eyes father-in-lawed with immediate recognition. He pulled his scarf down and it was Mitch. A knot twisted in my stomach. I hadn't seen him since I saw something crawl out of his mouth and leave his body in a mangled heap on the kitchen floor. "Brandon," he said. Not sure if it was actually me. It was dark. The interior light of my car was broken. "Mitch," I said back, even though I already knew it was him. "How?" While he looked back over his shoulder. "Small world." I nodded. Part of me actually considered just flooring it, getting the duck out of there, but I didn't. Maybe this was Mitch after all. Maybe his death was nothing but another nightmarish vision. But more than anything, I think I stayed out of curiosity. Always curiosity. "What are the chances?" "Huh," said Mitch, turning back to me. I huffed. He was right about that. "I am a little stranded out here, you might have noticed." He ran a hand through snow-speckled, jet black hair. "Tried calling a tow truck, but the service out here." He threw up his hands. "You need a lift," I said, immediately regretting the offer. "You don't mind?" I shook my head. "Exit 25 on your way?" asked Mitch. "I'll take the bus from there." We drove in silence for the first 5 minutes. All the while, the elephant of the past sat between us. Finally, Mitch spoke up. "So, how've you been?" I knew exactly what he was asking about. He wanted to know what happened after I said duck it and threw his list of rules to the curb. But that was the last thing I wanted to talk about. No more ruminating. No more obsessing over answers. Ever since I moved away from that godforsaken house, my life had improved significantly. And that's all that mattered. "I've been good," I said. Another awkward silence followed as Mitch expected me to ask him the same. I reached for the radio and turned the knob. Static blared. Every channel was nothing but white noise. "Yeah, no signal out here," said Mitch, rubbing his hands together from the cold. I turned off the radio and gripped the steering wheel. "How've you been?" I finally offered. "Up and down," he said. "No more work thanks to COVID, so I had to move in with Paul." I raised an eyebrow. Mitch caught my look and shrugged. Thought maybe I was wrong about it. "You know." "Wrong about what?" "Some of my theories." Mitch turned away and looked out the window, his breath fogged against the glass. White lines of falling snow streaked past. "What brings you upstate?" I asked, curiosity slowly building again. "Just needed to get out of town." "Fair enough." Mitch opened his mouth like he was about to say something else, but he stopped, shook his head a little, and turned back to look out the window. More silence. He glanced down, and his eyes caught something, the chrome switchblade, sitting in the cup holder. He reached down and lifted it up, studying it. "Where'd you get this?" "Weed dealer," I said. "Back in high school." Mitch turned the blade, flicked it open, and flicked it shut. "Huh." He tossed it back into the cup holder and leaned back in his seat. "I am gonna get some sleep," he said, shifting his weight. He nestled his head against his seatbelt, and shut his eyes. Despite my paranoia, I felt calmer now. This felt like the real Mitch, but even if it wasn't, I'd be dropping him off in a few exits anyway. About 30 minutes later, I pulled off onto exit 25. The car bumped over a snag in the road, and Mitch stirred awake. "Next left up there," he said, still groggy. We turned down a narrow road, walls of dark forest on either side. About 100 feet ahead, a lonely bus stop, lit only by the cold bluish glow of a solitary streetlight. I pulled to a stop in front of it. "Thanks, Brandon," said Mitch, reaching for the door. I could tell he still wanted to say something else, but was holding back. "Of course, Mitch. Be safe." He nodded, pulled open the door, and paused. He pulled the door shut, turned back to me, and sighed. Reaching into his jacket, he pulled out the brown paper envelope. I studied him. "It's okay if you don't want to talk about this," but he rubbed his forehead with his palm. "I've been digging a little, doing some more research again," and well, his eyes turned deadly serious. "I think I've almost figured this thing out." He reached into the envelope and pulled out an inch-thick stack of papers, photos, and documents. "I think I know what it wants, what it's trying to do." My curiosity was screaming at me, begging me to listen, but "Thanks, Mitch. I am good." He looked at me, confused. I cleared my throat, trying to keep all that in my past now. Mitch stared at me for a long 5 seconds, then nodded slowly. He slid the stack of papers back into the envelope and reached for the door handle. "You change your mind, just call me," he said, almost indignant. He pushed the door open and stepped back out into the cold. The snow had turned into a sludgy mix of slush and rain now. Mitch slammed the door shut, wandered up to the bus stop, and sat down on the bench, clenching my jaw. I shifted into drive and pulled away. I'd like to say I kept driving. I'd like to say I left Mitch at the bus stop, and that was the end of it, that I finally won out against my obsession for answers. But I didn't. Barely made it 50 feet before I pulled into reverse and drove back. I leaned over and pushed open the passenger side door. He looked at me, not surprised that I had returned. He pushed up from the bench, strode over to the car, sat down in the passenger seat, and pulled the door shut. The engine idled as slush and rain beat down from above, the lukewarm gust of ventilation against my face. Window wipers uselessly wiping the same mess of icy mush back and forth. Mitch reached into his jacket, pulled out the envelope, and placed it on the dashboard. "You're sure about this?" he said. I wasn't, but I nodded anyway. Mitch's mother-in-law grimly reached into the envelope and pulled out the stack of papers. "So after you left my apartment," he slowly flipped through the papers as he spoke, "I called up Paul, told him what happened, told him you were hysterical, that you broke the door to get out. I still don't know why I called him, but I did. I think some part of me still believes he's my dad. I still do." Mitch stopped on a photograph, paper clipped onto a page scrawled with manic notes and scribbled coat rack sketches. It was a photo of him, as a kid, with the rest of his mother-in-law, his mother Holly, his dad Paul, and even his late sister, Evelyn. All of them stood outside a blue tent dressed for camping, smother-in-lawing. "Happy," Mitch smother-in-lawed sadly as he flipped to the next page. "A month or so after you left, my work fell apart. As I told you, couldn't afford to pay rent, buy food. So I asked Paul if I could move in at first. It was out of necessity, but also, I started wondering again, after our last meeting, maybe there's a way to figure this all out. Maybe even put a stop to it. I guess something told me the answer was at Paul's house." He placed the stack of papers onto the dashboard and glanced down. His eyes caught the ashtray, full of cigarette butt remnants from my temporary smoking relapse. "You mind if I?" Mitch reached into his pocket and pulled out a pack of smokes. "Go for it." Mitch nodded, squeezed a cigarette between his lips. He pulled out a lighter. He flicked, but no flame. Flicked again. Still nothing. I reached into my own pocket, pulled out my lighter, reached across, and flicked it on. Mitch leaned forward, inhaled the tip of his cigarette into the flame, and leaned back. "Thanks," he said, exhaling smoke. I tucked the lighter away. Mitch scratched his eyebrow with his thumb, his eyes darting back and forth as he watched the window wipers seesaw. The blue glow of the streetlight cast shadows of trailing raindrops onto his face, almost like sad clown makeup. He cleared his throat. "So I moved in with Paul, took the guest room. What about his old army friend?" Mitch nodded. "Lawrence. Apparently, his condition worsened. He had to go back down south for full-time care in a real hospital. At least, that's what Paul told me." "You saw him, right, Lawrence?" I nodded. "Covered in bandages." I nodded again. "There's no reason to have decades-old burn injuries bandaged like that," said Mitch. That simple fact wedged into my head like a needle. I turned back and stared out through the windshield. Headlights cast into the darkness ahead. The road seemed to stretch on for eternity now. On either side, motionless trees stood like an audience of silent watchers, ancient, apathetic. Mitch shuffled through the stack of papers and pulled out another photograph. "Look." I looked. The inside of a shed, father-in-law with dozens upon dozens of coat racks. "This was in Paul's backyard," said Mitch. He tucked the photo away and pulled out an aerial blueprint of the neighborhood. Lines of blue ink led away from Paul's house in a branching web-like pattern. "He's got tunnels leading to every house in the neighborhood. I think he's the one breaking in, leaving coat racks in the corners." "Why?" Mitch butt his cigarette out in the ashtray. "I haven't figured everything out yet, but I am getting there." He rubbed his nose and continued. "Your friend, Zachary Serrano. I think Paul was drunk driving one night, all those years, and hit this kid on the interstate. Took his body and buried it up by the Balry Cliffs. How did he know about Zach?" I shook my head. "I talked with Zach's mother, and she said a guy confessed to it. Mason Parker. Right. Long-haul trucker." I didn't respond. Mitch held up a printout of a news article. "Parker came forward about it 2 years back." "Right." Again. I didn't respond. Mitch, increasingly frantic, pulled out another photo and tossed it on the dashboard. A dead body in a basement corner, naked and decomposing. A plastic bag wrapped over its head. It was the same image that flashed through my mind when I talked with Zach's mom. "Where did you get this?" "That's not important. This guy, Mason Parker. He lost his mind in the months leading up to his suicide." Mitch made finger quotes on the word suicide. "Same method my sister used, by the way." His eyes looked slightly crazier with each passing minute. "Mason was on house arrest when he started telling his supervisors that he never actually confessed, that he never even hit anybody. He told them some guy, a drunk driver from a parallel timeline or something, hit and run this kid, Zach, then switched places with Mason. He told them this guy could hide behind people's faces, look out through their eyes. Of course, they wrote him off as insane." I shook my head. "Brandon, I know it sounds crazy, but trust me here, I've almost figured this out." "What about Howie?" I said, finding it hard to hear about Zach. "I am not 100% on him, but I think he's a vessel for the intruder. A channel to spy on new recruits, so to speak. I didn't respond. Mitch pulled out another image. Shards of glass on the road. Police caution tape. A wreck of a blue Toyota hatchback upside down in a ditch. Totaled. That's your car. Right. This car. The car we're in right now. Again. I didn't respond. When you visited my apartment, you told me you almost hit a bear on the way over. Right. I squinted at the image. This car had my license plate. If it was a fake, it was a convincing fake. So the next day, Mitch continued, I went out to investigate, and I found this accident scene. Police were already there. Apparently, the driver died on impact. I did some more digging, and it turned out the driver's name was Brandon Mother-in-Lawler. I didn't know what to say. My head was starting to spiral. Brandon, listen to me. I have more proof. He pulled out a copy of a police report, detailing the nature of the crash. This wasn't easy to get a hold of, he said, holding it towards me. I waved it away, starting to feel my sanity slipping again. Brandon, this is important. I think I know how to stop it too. I think I can get you, and maybe even my dad, back to normal. I rolled my eyes. So I was dead the whole time or something, I said, trying to stay grounded. No. But this version of you died. He held up another image. A close-up of the driver's seat in the totaled car. A body hunched over the steering wheel. Face hidden. It's just like what happened with my dad when he tried driving his truck off the Bullery Cliffs. I think it created another version of you. And I am that version. No, well, I don't know. Maybe. Why? What does it want? I am still figuring that part out. What does Zach have to do with it? I think my dad killing Zach is maybe what started all this, like he hit this kid. And somehow the intruder showed up. And helped him escape. The consequences. Like he made a deal with the devil. I mean, I have other theories too. This is just one. But we could put together what we both know. And actually figure this out. Think about it, he said. His eyes father-in-law with manic energy. I am thinking about it, and it sounds ducking crazy, Mitch. Mitch ignored the slight. When I was a kid, like really young, I went out to the garage late one night, and my dad was there, power washing blood off his truck. Told me he hit a coyote, and I believed him. But now he trailed off and pulled out another photo. Look, the image was of a severed finger laying atop blood-streaked asphalt. A yellow evidence number 8 sign beside it. That's from your friend, Zach, where he died. That's his finger. I winced, and looked away. Didn't need to see that. Think about it. Brandon. Mitch continued. You just left town, ignored the rules, and now your life is ducking better. Did you really think you could get away from it that easy? Like the rules didn't mean anything? Did you really think this was over? He looked at me expecting an answer, but I just stared at him, seeing the same crazed obsession in his eyes, the same obsession that almost killed me. Mitch turned away. So I went back to Paul's house about a week ago, and he's not even there. The place is boarded up, overgrown, like abandoned. For years, I even asked the neighbors about it. It's like he just stopped existing. Mitch, he ignored me. There's too many connections here. Too much evidence. You can't just move on with this, Brandon. We need to figure this thing out. We can make sure this doesn't happen to anybody else. Mitch, we can even figure out why your friend Zach had to die. We can figure out how to save you from this. Save Paul. Maybe even save my sister. Mitch, I am heading upstate to speak with Mason Parker's cousin. Ask her about what he said in the days leading up to. Enough. I snapped with bitter spite. Mitch looked at me, his eyes wide and sad, like a scolded dog. Brandon, are you not listening to me? Did you not see these photos? I've moved on, I said plainly, fighting every instinct in my body to keep listening. Keep searching for answers, but now I knew enough to know all this searching led nowhere good. True or not, this only led to misery. Mitch stared at me in disbelief. He lifted the stack of the papers. This is theirs. I shook my head. And he trailed off into silent defeat. I stared straight ahead, eyes locked on the road. Mitch sighed and reached for the door. He froze, hand on the latch. I found your story online. The words hung in the silent air. Mitch's hand slid off the door latch, down to his thigh. You know it's using you. Right. Again. He waited for my response, but I remained quiet. You need to take that story down. I shut my eyes, trying to stay calm, trying to focus. Did you seriously forget about no third parties? Brandon. I opened my eyes. You need to take that story down. The more people read it, the more influence he gains. It's using you. Why do you think my dad randomly encouraged you to pick up writing again? Does that really make sense to you? Thanks, Mitch. I'll think about it. Mitch's eyes shot down to the switchblade in the cup holder, then back to me. His eyes flicked back and forth, considering terrible options. Mitch, I am not saying I don't believe you. You might even have some of this figured out. I am sure you do. But you told me yourself, all this obsession, searching for answers, it's not leading anywhere good. For a moment, his eyes father-in-law with half understanding, an understanding that faded as he turned away and stared out the window. This is all I got now, he said, placing the brown envelope onto his lap. He pushed open the door and stepped outside, turning back. He hunched down and met my eyes. "Take that story down," he said. But this time it sounded like a threat, a genuine threat, considering he likely knew where I lived. He looked back over his shoulder into the dark forest. That's when I noticed something I hadn't before. All night, Mitch's face had been mostly concealed in the darkness. But now in the dim glow of the street light, I could see something strange scarring at the corners of his lips, pink and blotchy, like it was cut with a knife and healed over. Subtle, but unmistakable. An image flashed through my mind, Mitch standing in the middle of his apartment kitchen. Head snapped back, his gaunt hands pushed out of his throat, and the corners of his lips started tearing. "See you round, Brandon," said Mitch, tucking the envelope away and pushing the door shut. He wandered back towards the bus stop. He sat down. I looked straight ahead, and took another deep breath. I exhaled. I shifted into forward, pulled a U-turn, and drove away. At the four-way stop about 100 feet down the road, I reached up to adjust the rearview mirror and the bus stop was empty. Mitch was gone. I looked back over my shoulder. A crawling chill slid down my spine. He was standing in the road now, standing with pin-straight posture beneath the streetlight. His back turned to me. Icy rain and slush beat down from above. He stood motionless, unaffected. The light flickered, and I almost expected him to disappear or move closer. But he didn't. He just stood in the exact same spot, staring out into the endless dark. Rigid. I floored at the duck out of there, sped all the way home and never looked back. That was the last time I saw Mitch, or at least that version of him. But something tells me he'll show up again. Maybe in a month, maybe in a year, maybe on my deathbed. I know the intruder isn't finished with me yet. I don't think he's finished with any of us, you included, but I am okay with that. I'd be lying if I said Mitch's theories don't bother me. Despite all his insanity, some of it actually made sense. A disturbing amount of sense. For 3 weeks straight, I fought the urge to investigate further. The urge to start Googling Mason Parker, Paul Carver, Zachary Serrano. I told myself it was all part of the intruder's game. The photos, the threads, all of it was just bait. Tantalizing crumbs of half-truths. All designed to pull me back into his clusterduck of convoluted conspiracy. It wasn't easy, but I resisted. I am not proud of much, but I am proud of that. I went for a hike last week. Needed to clear my head. So I drove downstate. Went to the same trail Zach and I used to explore as kids. I dressed for winter and brought a pack of vanilla-flavored cigarillos. Figured I earned a one-time relapse after pushing through all this. I brought my switchblade along too, just in case. Everything felt different out here now. Smaller, covered in patches of melting snow. I wandered down the winding trails, down past Old House, past the Rendlesons, down towards the base of the Cauldron Cliffs. The old rusted car was still there too, the same one Zach wanted to stand on. Half stuck in the frozen riverbed. The air was crisp. A gentle breeze swept up from downriver, and pushed through me like a spirit. I stepped up to the edge of the bank. I breathed in. I stepped out, setting a foot onto the ice. It was solid like concrete. I exhaled. I set both feet out. It felt safe. I shuffled across the river towards the abandoned car, slipping as I went. I stood on top of the rusted car, in the middle of the icy riverbed at the bottom of the Cauldron Cliffs. I pulled a smoke out, lit up, inhaled. The warm rush of nicotine poured through me like an old, but toxic friend. I'd like to say I had some profound insight here, some meaningful revelation, but I didn't. If anything, I just felt sadder about Zach than I ever felt before. I sat there for about an hour, maybe 2. It was hard to know. Another breeze pushed up from downriver and chilled through me. It was getting colder. Time to go. I tucked the now empty pack of smokes back into my pocket. I pushed up from the dead car, and hobbled my way back across the icy riverbed, and stepped up onto the riverbank. Time to go home. I made my way back up the winding trails, up past Old House, past the Rendlesons, over Planters Creek. I turned the corner and stepped onto the last stretch of long straight path through the sparse winter forest, the same path from my last memory with Zach. I kept walking and a branch snapped behind me. I spun around. About 20 feet down, the path a grizzly, malnourished and gaunt, lumbered onto the trail. I froze. I didn't even know grizzlies lived here, but even if they did, shouldn't it be hibernating? The bear froze, stared at me, and huffed hot fog pushed out through its nostrils. Fear rushed through me like a knife. I stepped backward, started to turn away, started to think about running, but I stopped. I turned back. I stared into the old creature's silent eyes. I took a deep breath. I exhaled. The bear raised its head, studying me, judging me. "Hey," I said, as calm as I could manage. "How've you been?" The bear's head tilted slightly, and it took a quick step forward. I didn't move. I kept talking. I told her about how I used to go hiking up here with my friend Zach. I told her about my year, about the coat rack in the basement corner. All the while, slowly backing up. The bear matched my pace, the gap between us shrinking with each step. I stopped moving, reached back, pulled out my pack of smokes, an empty carton now. I placed it gently on the ground. Then, I took another careful step backward. The bear matched me, pushed forward as I stepped back. I stopped. I gritted my teeth and this time, took a step forward, a step towards the bear. It looked at me. Confused. Primal fear shuffling through my body like a deck of mana cards. But I didn't have time to worry about that right now. I set it aside. The bear sniffed the air again. Then took another, more cautious step forward. And another one. Everything in my body screamed at me to run. Screamed at me turn heel and bolt. But I didn't. I stood motionless, eyes locked with the bear. She reached the carton on the ground and bent forward, sniffing it, turning it over with her nose. Curious, I exhaled slowly, and took another step back. She looked up at me, almost annoyed at my being there now. She went back to biting and pawing at the pack. I took another step, and another one. One step after another until I was 50 feet away, until I was 100 feet away, 200 feet. I stepped backward until I reached the bend, rounded the corner, walked to the parking lot, got in my car, and drove back home. Again, no profound insights or realizations came over me. I just felt sad. I missed my dad. I missed Zach. Of course, I know this isn't done. I don't think it ever will be. I know I haven't seen the last of Mitch, Howie, maybe even Paul. I know Mitch isn't going to stop until this story is taken down. And something tells me the intruder will follow me until the day I die. I've learned to live with that. Whatever happens, I am okay with it. I am not happy about it, but I'll accept it. Honestly though, Mitch might be right. I even considered deleting this story. It seems possible that the intruder, if he's real, might be using me. Might be using me to spread its influence to whoever reads this. But I don't care anymore. Why would I? For the first time in my life, I am okay with waking up in the morning. I am okay with existing. And, as much as I hate to admit it, ever since the intruder showed up, ever since I stopped following those stupid rules, ever since I stopped searching for answers, ever since I accepted things and moved on, my life's only gotten better. Maybe yours will too. Different versions of Paul. With HAT. I mean, how crazy would that be? And maybe there's a different version of Mitch, so that's why Mitch called Paul. Edit. Thanks for my very first award. My thoughts exactly. The Mitch who called here invited OP over was not the same Mitch who cut off contact earlier. He had become an agent of the intruder just like Paul. And maybe that's what happens when the intruder finally gets to someone. It creates a replica of the person and manipulates the replica to infect more potential victims. It's likely people with traumatic memories are more susceptible to its influences, making OP an easy target. I am worried that even if OP somehow gets out of Paul's house, he is too far gone mentally to stop everything. Only if OP could talk to the person that could be the real Paul, so he could figure out who that person is. Plus he seemed scared or startled when he saw OP. I definitely feel like OP might be getting too far gone, cause it was mentioned he started rubbing his head just like everyone else was. I thought you were dead, bro. Oh my god. I'm starting to get the vibes that maybe you are the crazy person. Why else would Paul say they should involve the authorities at some point? I'm assuming he means cops, which would make you the bad guy. And that all of this bonus weird stuff is happening to you now makes it seem like maybe something snapped in you. I'd seek help for yourself maybe. We're worried. Tell us more soon. Yeah, I really started to believe halfway through this series this is all some sort of multiple personality disorder or something. Or maybe that's just what in telling myself to try and sleep tonight.